Hello, my name is Adam Hacker, and I will be presenting about A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, a book by Adam Rutherford. So, to give a quick little rundown of what we will be going over today, I'll first start off with our relationship to AP Bio and kind of discussing the content of the book and how this relates to many of the topics we discussed this past year. Then I'll lead into my favorite topic within the book, the title of the chapter named Fate, and how this relates to genetics. Finally, I'll be going over controversy and ethics and kind of diving into the world of genetics and how this implicates and how this changes our future. So, first, our relationship to AP Bio. To give some context, this novel is about everything genetics, specifically in the scope of the human genome and how genetics has affected both our past and will affect our future. So, leaning into the idea about the past, we have chapter 5 of AP Biology, which talks about heredity. Heredity is the process of inheriting genes from our parents and how we eventually will pass on our genes to our own children. Heredity is discussed heavily throughout the novel as the author gives a large emphasis or gives a lot of examples on how the past has now affected our present. He gives many different examples from different time periods across decades ago and how the actions of our ancestors have very largely affected the traits and the characteristics we see in people today, talking about the Neanderthals and many different types of examples from the past and how those interactions from decades and many years ago very largely affect today through the idea of heredity and the passing of these traits. Then we have chapter 6, which talks about gene expression and regulation. This is very prominent in the chapter I'll be talking about later called Fate, but it kind of AP Biology dives into the idea of gene expression. Just because we have genes doesn't mean that we're expressing them fully, and the more we express a certain amount of genes is the higher chance that these traits will be, carried out. And the book talks heavily about this in determining how fate is kind of a real thing and how fate could technically be called genetics because if our genetics determine how we look and how we act, then these ideas have been determined for years now, 17 years for me at least since I've been alive. So that kind of is the chapter 6 of AP Biology talking about gene expression. Then chapter 7 is about natural selection. This kind of leans into the ideas both discussed in chapter 5 and chapter 6 and talks about how both, again, the actions of our ancestors determine the fitness of a specific organism or the fitness of a specific person and how they're able to pass on these traits. So again, our history, of course, affects the present day, and our present day will one day be the history for the next generation. So genetics is just kind of this everlasting flow that is constantly adapting, constantly evolving to both fit the needs of the past generation and to adapt to the new generation. So now on to my favorite thing I learned throughout this book, and that's the idea of fate. And wow, did this, change my perspective and kind of give me a new way to think. I've always understood genetics as a way of predicting, at least physical attributes. And I feel like that's a majority of what we talk about in AP Bio. We talk about genetics determining our hair color, our height, our eye color. But this book kind of leaned more towards the psychology part or the mental side of genetics and how genetics can affect much more than just our outside appearance. Genetic has a large role in our trait determination, and it kind of talks about how these genes react to our environment and affect who we are. Now, I know this is a very broad and very general way to state kind of the obvious that genes determine who we are, but I think it will make more sense once I head into the controversy and the ethics and kind of understanding why this was the most interesting thing I learned throughout this book, although it might seem kind of obvious. So here we are, controversy and ethics. Kind of the mind-boggling moment for me, or the biggest controversy, is the idea of how determined are our lives. If genetics can determine the amount of neurotransmitters produced in my brain, which determine my dopamine levels and my anxiety levels, how determined are our lives? And I was thinking of this example earlier, but as I was typing on a document, I was thinking about the dexterity of my fingers. So I looked up on Google can genetics determine dexterity? And of course, they do have some play. So even in the smallest of actions, in the smallest of ways, genes determine my everyday life. Because that gene, which codes for my dexterity of my fingers, was helping me type out faster. And for other people, maybe it makes them type out slower. So how determined are our lives, and how is this subconscious idea, almost invisible to our eye, the idea of genetics, how this is affecting our everyday life? And then again, are we in control? Because we have the thoughts and we are able to make our own actions and decisions, but we're only able to make the actions that are determined by our genes. So are we truly in control? And as I was reading throughout this book, I found many cool examples of this idea of controlledness and determinedness. I remember reading about the tragic Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, and how as soon as that investigation was made, they made a point to look into the genealogy, into the genetics, looking for maybe if there was a specific gene pattern that coded for his tendency to be a murderer. And I think that leans into the ethics of it. How much should we rely on genetics to predict and justify different sorts of actions? The author made a really great point. If we were able to somehow find a genetic sequence that said, yeah, this guy's gonna be a murderer, how do we move forward with that piece of information? Do we let people carry out on their lives and then wait for them to make an action that leans into their genetics and then we prosecute? Or do we put them on a watch list, and do we look out for them because we think they might make this action that they're determined to do, because perhaps maybe we're not in as high of a control that we think we are? So the ethics of genetics is really interesting to me. And the idea of if we're in control, and if so, how protective should we be with the idea of genetics? And then I guess kind of the opposite of how controlled do we want to be? I mean, we're humans, we have our thoughts. And if we are not in control, humans tend to have the urge and the need to become in control. So the ethics of genetics is, how do we edit? And how do we modify, if at all? Because even if we make a modification that is for the benefit of humankind, what's to say that that same logic can be made against humans? And I mean, this has happened in the past, albeit when there wasn't as much scientific evidence, but genetics was kind of used as a scapegoat in the eugenics movement to prove and be racist towards African Americans and trying to promote the white race. My Black American Studies teacher would be very proud of me right now for referencing that, but the eugenics movement was used as a scapegoat for genetics in a sense. And while I don't think we'll face the same issue again, I think genetics can be used in a similar way that still promotes wrong ideas and bad ideas, and just using genetics as a scientific way to prove something based on profiling. So I found this to be kind of in conjunction with the idea of fate and the idea of controversy and ethics, and how this really is affecting our future and also affecting our now. So that was my presentation on what I learned about A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, a book by Adam Rutherford. It was a very engaging experience, and I'm glad I had this opportunity. And this book was truly an eye-opener, not to mention a very fun read as well. Thank you.